This short presentation is for presenters at the 2020 INAXO conference and how to fill out what we call an educational planning table, or EPT. And this is part of the actual forms and paperwork that we need to submit to ANCC, who is the organization that is our provider for contact hours. So the information in this EPT is absolutely essential for INAXO and for maintaining our accreditation status, as well as to award contact hours. So this is something that, as a presenter, it may come off initially as being a little daunting. We've never done it before. So we'll walk you through step by step. So the title of the activity, this was a regional workshop that was done with SSH and INAXO. And even though it's not an EPT for a conference, I thought that this educational planning table was well done. So I'm going to use this as our exemplar. And the one thing that I just want to stress is the title of your activity. What you put on there is essentially what you're married to. You can't decide 2 weeks later that I want to change it. You have to decide on a title and be comfortable and confident in it, because the EPT table is used for, the nurse planners to actually construct a whole other document that we need to keep on file for ANCC. So I guess the bottom line is really like your title, because you're going to have to stick with it. The identified gaps, and essentially where is that knowledge gap? What is it that your presentation is intended to fill? And so for this, it was related to the lack of evidence for the INAXO standards and accreditation and certification of SSH, as well as the implementation of the National Council of State Board of Nursing, the Guidelines and Simulation Program. So, what these individuals, are identifying is that people lacked an awareness of all of these. And so this regional workshop was intended to be able to address these needs. So a description of the current state, it is what's going on now, what has changed, what do learners need to know about? And so for this study, the National Council of State Board of Nursing SIM guidelines, at the time these were recently released for pre-licensure programs, as well as revisions being made to the INAXO standards of best practice. But yet, it was unclear if educators know how to use these guidelines as well as the standards. And it was also unclear in terms of the current state if educators know how to actually implement the standards of best practice. And that stakeholders have noted educators seem to have questions about what is certification and accreditation. So that is the sort of current state of what's going on now. And then a description of a desired or achievable state is what is it that you want your learners to walk away with? What information do you want them to know at the end of the presentation? So for this regional workshop, it was for the learner to gain knowledge of these guidelines for SIM and INAXO standards of best practice, and that, the learner understand the rationale, process, and benefits of certification and accreditation, as well as become a member of an international simulation organization. And the gap to be addressed is knowledge, and I would assume that the majority of you or who are presenters and who are presenting, a conference presentation, it's going to be knowledge, unless, of course, you're doing a hands-on workshop where you're actually, practicing skills. But in general, the gap to be addressed is usually within the domain of knowledge. Okay, so moving on, we come to what are called learner outcomes. And that is, are you looking at nursing, professional development, patient outcomes, or other? And what you do need to check is nursing professional development. They also require, ANCC also requires learning objectives. You will see that there's 9 learning objectives here, but please keep in mind that this is a 6-hour workshop. So that's why there are so many learning objectives. Generally, 3 learning objectives per an hour of presentation is more than sufficient. And you really want them these learning objectives to match the content that you're going to be providing. And in general, if you look at, the different domains of learning objectives, think about what you're presenting and at what level, of a learning objective you really want your, participants to be able to achieve. So once you have those learning objectives, then you come down to the section of what's called content, the time frame. How many minutes are you going to spend on specific, topics in your outline? Who's the presenter and the author? And the teaching methods and learner engagement strategies. And ANCC separates those. And so teaching methods are things that we think about: lecture, PowerPoint. Learner engagement strategies is really what ANCC is absolutely going after. They want active learning strategies. So you'll see for, under the content for the National Council of State Board of Nursing SIM guidelines, they're spending 120 minutes on it. The presenters, and then not only do they have PowerPoint, but they have question and answer, discussion, small group work specific to individual state boards of nursing requirements, and then they have what is a faculty development checklist. So think about how you can engage your learners to actively participate in your presentation. This is a very long, content table because it being a 6-hour workshop. Please don't be overwhelmed. Your content table will not be this big. But as I go through and look at these active engagement strategies, they have, again, breakout sessions, small groups to brainstorm and develop one's own SIM center needs. So that is really important to ANCC. So I'm just going to scroll down to the end of this and move on to the next section, which is a list of evidence-based references used for developing this activity. So this section has to have a minimum of 3 evidence-based or, data-driven or, empirical references, and it usually is in the last 3 years. I don't think that anybody is going to, be concerned if it's greater than 3 years, but if you're talking about a simulation study that was 20 years ago and there is a significant amount of literature that's been published on that topic within the last several years, you need to be current. So again, you need a minimum of 3 references and those that are evidence-based. And you can see they have many, many references here. And then finally, you get into, time spent evaluating the learning activity, essentially is contact hours. So it's the total minutes divided by 60. So this happens to be 360 minutes divided by 60 is 6 contact hours. And likely if you're going to do an hour presentation, it's 60 minutes divided by 60, which would be 1 contact hour. And you can have less than 1 contact hour, 0.7, 0.9. And then finally, you just need to put your name and your credentials and the date you signed it. And method of contact, calculate contact hours, the nurse planners will be taking care of that. So that essentially is how you complete an EPT table. For those of you who are nurse educators, this is shouldn't be new information. That you probably learned a lot of this in setting up learning objectives in a syllabus. So this is just a snapshot of that syllabus for one learning activity. And so the more in general, just kind of departing points, the more specific you can be, the more clear and direct to the point. It doesn't need to be a huge amount of information, but the information needs to be clear, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be based on, the current literature. There is another education planning table that is posted in Cadmium for you if you'd like to see another example. But in general, what I showed you today is an example of a very well done and complete EPT table. Thank you for your time and attention.